We thank you for the opportunity to share with you this afternoon. Canada's experiment with legalized euthanasia and assisted suicide has resulted in an untold number of deaths. As church, we need to keep educating ourselves as to why this is and why so many people are turning to euthanasia as a response to suffering. So a very special thanks to the organizers of the Freedom Summit on behalf of my wife Jennifer and I for putting on this event and doing just that, helping us as church learn how to respond to the ever-increasing events of euthanasia in our country. As was said by Larry, I work with ARPA Canada. ARPA Canada has been speaking into the topic of euthanasia for many years now. We were interveners in the 2015 Supreme Court Carter case that ultimately struck down Canada's laws prohibiting assisted suicide. ARPA has also presented multiple times at parliamentary committees, each time imploring them to protect the lives of vulnerable Canadians. We have also activated tens of thousands of people through our Care Not Kill campaign, an effort aimed at facilitating dialogue between neighbors within families and to those in government. Even though those in authority have not heeded our warnings and pleas, we still believe it is necessary to share a positive message about how we need to embrace those who are suffering with life-affirming actions, how caring is better than killing. But our role as Christians goes even further than just sharing a specifically political message with governments. We need to model how to suffer to the world around us. Suffering as witness. What does that look like? J.R. Miller, a Presbyterian author and pastor in the 19th and early 20th centuries, once wrote this in a paper titled The Ministry of Comfort. Miller says, "Ofttimes the primary reason why godly men are called to suffer is for the sake of witness they may give to the sincerity of their love for Christ and the reality of divine grace in them. The world sneers at religious profession," Miller goes on to say. "It refuses to believe that it is genuine. It defiantly asserts that what is called Christian principle is only selfishness and that it would not stand severe testing. Then, godly men are called to endure loss, suffering, or sorrow, not because there is anything particular evil in themselves which needs to be eradicated, but because the Master needs their witness to answer the sneers of the world." As Canada's euthanasia regime becomes more and more expansive, it is as though the world is sneering at us. How do we answer? What is our response? Well, one such response is by witnessing how to embrace suffering. God's word is clear. Suffering is part of life. It comes in all shapes and forms, and everyone will experience it in one way or another. And that the most important part of suffering is how we respond to it. Now, there are times in our work when the cerebral, the things that go on in our minds, the policy work that we engage in, becomes an actual lived experience. These moments have an incredible impact on us, both as individuals and collectively within our families and faith communities.
This is our son, Markus. In the spring of 2021, Markus was 17 and looking forward to graduating from grade 12 at the local Christian high school. Markus was an entrepreneur at heart, and at this time, he had already put together an entire business plan to start his landscape maintenance company. Everything was ready to launch upon completion of his high school. But God had other plans.
On February 26, 2021, Markus was diagnosed with Ewing sarcoma, an aggressive form of bone cancer. God led our family through the furnace of suffering that concluded with Markus's death only 15 months later, on May 29, 2022, in the quiet of a Sunday afternoon. Markus's prognosis wasn't good from the start. The cancer, it had already metastasized at diagnosis, and it was found in his shoulder, in his liver, spine, and lungs. Markus's treatment included 20 rounds of chemotherapy, 5 weeks of radiation, and a major surgery to replace his upper right arm with an internal prosthesis. Yet in spite of all this medical treatment, it was not in God's providence to heal Markus. 2 months prior to his passing, we, along with Markus, made the decision to end treatment for cure and focus instead on living well as they treated symptoms that arose along the way. What we are about to share with you was chronicled on a blog that we used to update Markus's journey with cancer, and as such, it is not secret, but it is deeply personal.
We didn't want to go to the Canuck Place Hospice. Markus didn't want to go either. It was in Vancouver, and we lived about an hour away. He wanted to die at home, surrounded by his family, but he also didn't want to experience the intense pain and suffering that he knew would come as his lungs filled with tumors. Every day of the last week of his life was another turn towards glory. First, it was the morphine injections that I would give him. Then came the oxygen bottle. Then came the machine that made a constant supply of additional oxygen. Our nurse Shanna came every morning to assess and write new prescriptions. Every day, sometimes more than once, Mike was going to the pharmacy to get additional medication.
On Friday morning, Nurse Shanna took a look at Markus and said, "His time is short." She advised us to take the window we had for Markus to be transported to the Canuck Place Hospice. With the increased intensity of Markus's care, we concurred.
It turns out it was the best decision we could have made. Soon after we arrived at the hospice, a beautiful, converted 100-year-old mansion in Vancouver, all of Markus's physical care was taken over by doctors and nurses on staff there. No more doctor mom, just mom and dad. Markus said to us, "It doesn't feel like a hospital at all. It feels more like an Airbnb."
It was clear that Markus's time was going to be short. He slept a lot that first afternoon. Every time he would wake up, he would look at us with a surprised expression on his face and say, "Oh, I thought I was in heaven." And then a little smile would appear on his face and he'd say, "But this is good too." The hospice had room for all of us to stay, so throughout the afternoon, all of our children and our one grandchild began to arrive. As we entered the evening, it appeared that Markus would only last a few more hours. And so he called and motioned each one of us to his bedside, one at a time, saying precious goodbyes, telling us all that he loved us, even sharing with his big brother Micah that we need to say, "I love you," more.
At around 11 o'clock that night, Markus motioned to me. When I went to his bedside, Markus told me he wanted everyone to be quiet. "I want a private moment with God," he said. I asked him, do you want us to leave? He said, "No, just be quiet."
He folded his hands over his body, and we all marveled at this act of faith from our son and brother. We knew that he was finished praying when his hands flopped back to his side. That night, some of us slept in the suites upstairs, and as each of his siblings said goodnight to Markus, he told them that he loved them, and to each he would say, "See you in paradise."
Mike and I didn't sleep at all that night, but took turns sitting beside Markus. The nurses maintained his medication, and Markus assured us that he was very comfortable and not in any pain.
As dawn arrived with filtering light through the windows, we realized that God had another day in store for Markus. Around 6 a.m. that Saturday morning, I asked him if I should see if his buddies could come and say their goodbyes. His eyes lit up. "Yes, that would be great," he said. I called one of his friends, and he told me that they'd be on their way in 15 minutes. It turned out that they were all sleeping over at one of the buddies' houses, hoping and praying that they would be able to say their final goodbyes to Markus. They arrived at 8 a.m., and for about an hour and a half, they cried, they laughed, they shared, and they prayed together. God even gave Markus energy to speak with each of them, and he shared words of encouragement, of advice, and even of admonition. The time they spent together will never be forgotten by his friends.
Gary, one of Markus's mentors, and his wife Marie, as well as my sister Karis, were also able to come and share time with Markus as they had their final conversations together. That afternoon, both sets of Markus's grandparents also came to say goodbye.
By early Sunday morning, Markus was non-responsive and his breathing had become a lot more shallow. As we watched the church service, we sung along with the songs and Markus's eyes would open a little bit. He knew we were singing.
We shed a lot of tears those few days together. Our tears would fall onto Markus as we leaned in to hear him speak to us. More than once he would say, "If I could cry, I'd be crying too."
And just before 2:30,
on Sunday afternoon, Markus's breathing slowed, and with each of us around his bedside, he took his final breaths. We have never felt so close to heaven as we did that afternoon. And as Markus's soul departed from his broken body, he entered into the presence of Jesus, and a large tear rolled down his cheek, and he was gone.
More than once when we were at the Canuck Place Hospice, I thanked God that euthanasia for children is still against the law in Canada. When we went to the hospice, we had no idea how long Markus would live. And yet, if pro-euthanasia advocates have their way and are successful, the day will come when families just like ours, sitting with their dying children in Canuck Place Hospice, will feel an obligation to end the suffering of their child by having a doctor euthanize him or her. That Friday night when we thought Markus was going to go, after we've all had our time to say goodbyes, it would seem like the compassionate thing to do, right? It's time, the nurse might say. You've all said your goodbyes. He doesn't have to suffer anymore. He should go now, she might say. But then we wouldn't have had that Saturday, a most beautiful day filled with precious memories and intimate experiences with our son, our brother, our grandson, and close friend.
Embracing the uncomfortable work of God is humbling and difficult, but it is the path we must choose. We suffered much with Markus, and we miss him terribly. But Markus showed us how to find meaning in suffering by never living as though he was dying and being thankful for each day that God gave him. To live well and to die well. Through the grace of God, it can be done.
Nancy Guthrie's writings on grief and sorrow have been invaluable for us throughout this journey, and we still read them regularly. In one such place, Guthrie writes, and I quote, "God's method of choice to help us grow spiritually is suffering. But suffering itself doesn't do the job. It is how we respond to the suffering that determines if the pain will take us deeper in our walk with God." Paul says in Romans 5:3 and 4, "We can rejoice too when we run into problems and trials, for we know that they are good for us. They help us learn to endure. And endurance develops strength of character in us, and character strengthens our confident expectation of salvation." We have often been challenged by Guthrie's question that follows, and pray that it challenges each one of us here today too, when she asks, "Are you willing to suffer well, if that is what is required?" As Christians, we have a wonderful but an immense calling to speak hope into a world that increasingly does not know what to do with suffering and appears to be embracing suicide as a legitimate response to ending it. Our Christian response to suffering, it can and will be an incredible witness to those around us. Thank you.